I will indeed introduce the STISE study. I was coordinator of the project. We performed this contract with the University of Ghent, with CE Delft, Goudappel and Tractable. So quite an interesting and rich consortium. And I will explain the different elements of the study, the approach, and the main results and conclusions. Our Dutch partners are unfortunately not here because of festivities in the Netherlands, King's Day, but that's a good excuse, I think. But we will manage with Luc and with my colleague Pierre today to explain you the details of the study. I will scroll through some slides. First of all, the context and the objective of the STISE study. The Eurodelta really exists. I think it's one of the aspects that we really learned and that was confirmed throughout the study. The Eurodelta is a mega region. It's a synergy formed by the Northwest European metropolitan regions and cities in the Netherlands, North Rhine-Westphalia, Flanders, and Brussels, and northwest of France. It's part of the most prosperous area of Europe, offering many benefits to its citizens and its economy. At the same time, these highly urbanized and densely populated regions run the risk of becoming less attractive and less livable. I don't need to explain you the congested roads, air pollution with serious consequences for health and economic developments. So clean and fast and certainly also cross-border connections in the Eurodelta between those big urban nodes could, however, become also a major strength in and of the Eurodelta region. It is in a European context quite extraordinary that almost 50 million people can be reached in about 3 hours of travel. And this makes the Eurodelta a global hub for goods, for services, for knowledge. And in addition, this mega region has a great potential to set an example also in the ambitious pursuit of helping to achieve the bigger European sustainability targets. On this next slide, you see the Eurodelta, our study area on the map, the Rhine-Scheldt, Rhine-Waal, and Brussels-Lille. Those three geographical corridors are highlighted here. They are important for the Eurodelta due to their cross-border challenges. These corridors were focused on to some extent in the study, but the strict corridor approach was abandoned a bit, if I can call it like that, in the course of the project, as the policy measures, I will come back to that later on, the policy measures that were selected and assessed are not really corridor specific. Those measures are and can be relevant for the corridors, but they are not corridor specific. But we will come back to that later on, and perhaps I don't need to put too much emphasis on this matter today. Anyway, let's move on. The next slide, you see a scheme, a very short overview of our approach, the approach that we used for the study. The core of the methodology of the study was a network analysis on the one hand and a policy analysis on the other hand. The network analysis evolved around the creation of a consistent image for the future for 2030 and 2050 to better understand how sustainable transport in the region is and will be, and which policy measures could be effective to help reaching sustainability targets. Those different elements will be explained later on. The baseline scenario that was built shows that with the overall expected growth of transport for freight and for passengers in the Eurodelta, sustainability appears to be far out of reach. Business as usual will not be sufficient to reach sustainability goals, and Europe, but also the Eurodelta more in particular, will need to move up a gear by pursuing bold policy choices to achieve the targets set in the big European agendas. The baseline scenario was combined with a set of external trends, as we call them, that most likely will impact the estimated existing transport growth in order to add some robustness to the baseline scenario result. As the model used for building this baseline is not very recent, and trends like COVID, energy transition, Brexit were not included in the model, but I will also come back to that later on. And in the last step, the potential impact of 4 cross-border policy measures with a focus on cleaner and faster mobility in the Eurodelta was assessed. Those 4 measures are from plane to train, as we call it, a shift from air to high-speed train travel for over distances of less than 500 kilometers, more zero-emission zones, mobility as a service, or the potential of mobility as a service at Eurodelta level, and the 4th measure concerned the from road to rail shift from road to rail for cross-border passenger transport. These measures relate to different modes, touch upon different domains, and they are from a research point of view considered scalable and achievable at Eurodelta level. The baseline scenario, some more details about that. First, again, the main steps in building the baseline scenario to better understand where it comes from and to explain a bit where the results come from. The TransTools model was used as a main model to build this baseline scenario, and the results were validated with the regional and national models in case of inconsistencies. The traffic demand was estimated to create an understanding of the transport flows, again, for both passengers and freight within our study area, and the expected growth of these flows towards 2050. These flows were then translated into emissions, for example, CO2, as a proxy for sustainability to understand the scope of the issues at hand. And as explained before, the baseline scenario was then combined with some external trends to add some robustness to that baseline scenario. What are the overall observations from that baseline scenario? The baseline scenario shows that with the overall expected growth of transport, sustainability appears to be far out of reach. The share of road for both freight and passengers as a dominant mode is, although not surprising, striking. The share of road for both freight and passengers as a dominant mode is, although not surprising, striking, as I said before. The combination of the transport flows with the expected developments in emission slightly changes the pictures regarding the focus and the opportunities at hand. However, when looking at the overall sustainability goals, the predominance of the car as the main mode of transport, also from a social inclusion perspective, needs attention, and combining various driving factors for this change might make it happen. Also because of the road network is congested and significant investments are necessary to alleviate specific bottlenecks. A focus on changing the way people travel is imminent. For freight, an additional complicating factor is the connection of transport with the seaside of transport. This is not in the scope of our STISE study, and the emissions from the seaside are combined with air, a large part of the overall transport emissions. From a Eurodelta perspective, focusing on intermodality and long-distance freight transport by train could partly tackle these emissions. Some numbers then. For the passengers, for CO2 emissions, the first aspect worthy to mention is the high share of air transport and emissions. In 2018, the share is 12% and it increases to 20% in 2050. Secondly, the impact of the forecasted availability of electric vehicles for road transport can clearly be seen with the negative trend of road transport emissions compared to the expected growth rates. For the NOx emissions and the PM10 emissions, aviation and road have comparable shares, with the highest share for aviation. And the emissions for this mode decline slightly between 2018 and 2050 with 20%. For road transport, the impact of the stricter regulations and guidelines regarding emissions combined with the increased market share of electrical vehicles lead to a reduction of emissions over time, with almost no emissions in 2050. Electric railways emit no NOx and PM10. And then for freight, some observations or some conclusions. For the CO2 emissions, the overall perspective share of road transport is clearly visible. However, until 2050, the emissions of road transport decreased by 58%, whereas rail and inland waterways reduced by 29% and 18% respectively. Thus, these shares, the relative shares, increase towards the future. For the NOx emissions, the observations are similar. The large decrease for road transport is only expected to happen after 2030, with the increase in electric and fuel cells operated trucks. For rails and inland waterways, the decreasing trend is a positive development. And for PM10 emissions, the share of road transport is still large, but with the decreasing trends, there appears to be a rather favorable evolution in these emissions. After 2030, rail will have almost zero emissions. This is just a summary table. It is all explained in the final report for those that are interested, that you can consult the report on the ESPON webpage, but we wanted to share some of these numbers at least. The external trends, I mentioned it a couple of times, but I think it's better to show perhaps this slide. So the baseline scenario was designed as, or is designed as, a business as usual scenario, and it includes forecasts for 2030 and 2050. And it is based on a European Trends Tools 3 model that was developed between 2011 and 2016. So the assumptions for the model forecasts have been defined several years before our study has been carried out. And meanwhile, obviously, a series of external trends have been and are evolving that could not and that are not taken into account sufficiently in the baseline scenario. You see them here, climate change and energy transition, technical evolutions, the growing globalization, circular economy, COVID, Brexit. So these trends are likely to affect the forecasts that we made for 2030 and 2050. So the consortium has determined, or has determined when we were performing the study, together with our stakeholders, an overview of external trends that may significantly affect the transport flows for passengers and freight within the Eurodelta in the future. And we selected 6, and an assessment, an estimation was made of how these trends could affect the results we came up with from a baseline scenario. And what is overall observations from that part of the study? The external trend analysis indicates that the demand for freight transport in the SURE area is likely to decrease for all modes compared to the baseline scenario. This decrease is mainly due to the growing circular economy and changes in the world freight routes, part of the further globalization in the transport sector. And then for passenger transport, an overall conclusion is that the trends indicate a shift from air and road to rail compared to the baseline scenario when the possible impact of autonomous vehicles, part of the trend technical evolutions, is neglected. If autonomous vehicles became available on a larger scale, they might result in a large shift from public transport to car usage, depending on the implementation in the overall transport system. It was not the easiest exercise, but we gave it a go, and those are the conclusions that we ended up with regarding the external trends. Then the policy analysis, the second biggest chunk of our research. I've already mentioned them before. We will dive into the first two in the later sessions this afternoon. We decided to go for those policy measures together with the stakeholders we worked intensely with in the STISE project. A three-step approach was followed based on the initial input from our stakeholders and an analysis of some policy documents. A long list was decided upon. A next step, a short list was selected, and we quick scanned this short list. We used some criteria such as added value, jobs, accessibility, social justice, well-being and acceptance, and so on, to finally come up with those 4 measures. It could have been different measures, it could have been other measures, but this is what we decided upon. The scope of the policy analysis is not focused on already implemented projects or policies in parts of the Eurodelta, but on ambitious policy measures or concepts that affect or that can affect the entire SURE area and or its border crossings, or the better connections in or between the major cities in the Eurodelta, and that could really make a difference. So that's how we also justified the selection of those 4 policy measures. But this is just an introduction. I will now quickly go through the 4 policy measures. The first one, aviation shift on short mid-range distances, I have to say. Luc will elaborate on this measure. Let me just follow the slides. But quickly an overview for all 4 of them. That's a good basis for the further discussions. So the first measure, aviation shift. What is the scope of this measure? It's a policy ban of all regular aviation services on short and mid-range distances below 500 to 700 kilometers within, to and from the Eurodelta, with a shift to high-speed rail, of course. In conclusion, long story short, and the long story will be explained by Luc, what is the impact of this policy measure? The shift from aviation to high-speed rail for short and mid-range distances could have a not neglectable impact for the CO2 and noise reduction in and around the 4 concerned airports in the Eurodelta. A reduction of almost 1 million tons of CO2 in 2030 and a bit less in 2050 could be achieved, contributing to about 0.1% to the overall ambitions of the European Green Deal, which is fairly high for a geographically area that covers hardly 1% of the European territory. And it would also give a boost to high-speed train and will possibly double or even quadruple the volumes of high-speed train travel on the existing tracks. So it could also have a major impact on domestic and short-range travel within the Eurodelta and lead to a shift from car to train. The next slide shows a high-level roadmap. So for each of those policy measures based on the research that we've done, based on consultation, based on an assessment also of the institutional framework in the area, which was also a part of the study. We provided in the report a high-level roadmap as a starting point to actually explore the options to do something with the results of the study, and we try to put them in a scheme so that the most important aspects of actual steps to perform or to take into account are mentioned there. But we can also talk about that later on. But for the high-level roadmap for implementation, one aspect that we could mention here is that this proposal for policy measure will need to be discussed with the European institutions first, European Commission, in order to bring about the required and necessary changes to the Open Skies agreements, for example. And we would suggest that the appointment of some sort of ambassador with the appropriate support, of course, of a team should coordinate activities to achieve this modality shift. Let's move on to the second measure, the zero emission zones, the ZES measure, as we called it. Next slide. Also, my colleague Pierre will elaborate more on that in his session afterwards, but also here, short description and the main conclusions. What is the scope of this measure that we assessed? It's the implementation of harmonized zero emission zones in all major cities located in the Eurodelta, and it's for passenger cars, light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles by 2035. In terms of impacts, by contributing with about 3% to the overall CO2 emissions of the Green Deal in 2030, the environmental impact of the zero emission zones measure could be considerable, taking into account the relatively small geographical scope of this particular policy measure. Harmonizing zero emission zones could also have substantial efficiency and societal benefits, but specific population groups and economic actors could be adversely impacted if no targeted accompanying measures are implemented. So that's really something to take into account. Also, experience shows that it is not easy, very difficult even to harmonize access criteria due to the subsidiarity principle, it's a legal term, while harmonizing other aspects could appear to be very challenging due to the high number of actors to be involved and the absence of an institutional framework to carry out such a process at the Eurodelta level. But we can discuss about this measure also more in detail. So I will move on to the roadmap also here, one sentence perhaps. Important here will be that an appropriate forum for policy dialogue should be set up to assess political feasibility and options for harmonization and the impact of that. Then the potential of mobility as a service, MAS, was the third policy measure. The third and the fourth policy measure are a bit different. It was more an exploration exercise, not a measure as such, but it was an interesting idea to consider and to explore within the scope of our study. What was the scope here? Exploring mobility as a service with focus on passenger transport from a public authority's perspective. So defining the role of public authorities, what is the role of public authorities in this development? How can they operate, and what is the potential benefits that they can realize if the measure is effective? Considering, of course, the required accompanying measures in order to realize this benefit. For the impacts, the potential of MAS measure shows a potential in realizing more sustainable transport. However, this potential is still largely uncertain, as it strongly depends on the position public authorities take and the necessary investments in both the digital and the physical infrastructure that need to be done to facilitate a larger model shift. This being said, the prerequisites as defined regarding standardization and sharing of data and information are no regret measures that can be kicked off immediately. And furthermore, development of a vision and an implementation plan for MAS and how it can contribute to the relevant societal goals is essential to grasp the real potential at hand. The roadmap, the high-level roadmap that we presented in the report, important first step is for policy measures, is to set up some kind of organization to coordinate the unlocking and the governance of MAS relevant data. And then the last measure is the cross-border train measure, so improving regional cross-border public train transport. How did we scope that measure? This policy focuses on the improvement of regional cross-border public transport in those 3 project corridors that we mentioned before, the Rijn-Waal, Rijn-Scheldt and Lille-Brussels. And the goal of this measure is to result in a shift from road to rail for those specific regional cross-border passenger travel. The impact of this policy measure, the assessment of the policy ambition is to improve cross-border rail transport. That it has shown that a shift from road to rail could be realized for several cross-border corridors. On the map, you can see some of the lines that highlight this. If the cross-border connections are well integrated with the national rail and bus services and passenger-friendly services are provided. This measure has the potential to contribute to more sustainable transport, and it is also in line with plans of the European Green Deal. Compared to the overall emissions in transport, the potential emission reduction for this measure compared to the others is perhaps quite limited, since the regional cross-border passenger segment is rather small. However, this policy should be seen in a broader context of shift from roads to rail. Regarding the roadmap, the main challenge here will be to optimize cross-border cooperation, as rail transport and infrastructure are currently organized by national or regional bodies and controlled by national authorities. So a first step is for regional and local stakeholders to learn from existing successful projects. And other main aspects are also highlighted in the roadmap. Next slide, next part, I'm jumping to the overall analysis and some conclusions, some thoughts from our side. This is the summary table that we included in the final report. We don't want to compare those measures. They are all very different. Also, the approaches used for assessments are quite different too, because of the nature of the measures. But this table summarizes the estimated impacts, quantitative impacts and qualitative aspects that came out of the research. And we can go deeper into the numbers and the conclusions when we discuss this in the next sessions. My next slides, some conclusions and the potential of the STISE studies. As mentioned before, those 4 measures, they do not contain completely new concepts, but the ambitious scoping of these measures on this specific geographical Eurodelta scale is unique. The study shows that in the context in which these 4 policy measures have been studied, they could all lead to an improvement in the sustainability within the Eurodelta, and thereby also contributing to the objectives set by Europe in this regard. in addition to the 4 studied measures, many other measures relevant to the Eurodelta and its authorities, and also positively impacting sustainability in the area, they could be or could have been and could be explored. Moreover, many other policies, initiatives in the Eurodelta could benefit from or get boosted by or find some additional support in our STISE study results. Initiating the STISE study and showing the willingness to roll up the sleeves and actually explore what steps can be taken, both within the relevant authorities' own services, but also outside at supranational or European level, puts the Eurodelta in a spotlight as a progressive mega region that wants to step forward as an innovative pioneer in Europe. I think that's something that we sensed throughout the study. And given its location and its corridors full of challenges and the drive of the many involved stakeholders in the Eurodelta, this region can be a very interesting and promising pilot area to try to implement ambitious policies and concepts, and this way demonstrate the sustainability gains that can be made. If some of these challenges or aspects could be achieved in the Eurodelta, it could serve as an inspiration for other regions. Only imagine the potential impact or effect at larger European scale, increasing the feasibility of the implementation of these measures will require, though, a multi-level cross-border approach and coordination also at Eurodelta scale. So I think those are the main concluding thoughts and remarks that we had at the end of the study. There are still some slides with some new insights, but I don't think we need to elaborate on that, as we touched upon that throughout the presentation. And I will end here, Luc. So I pass the floor to you.